Delivered into Covenant, Pivotal Moments in the Book of Exodus, Part 2 by Walter Brueggemann, Chapter 6. You were right, Sue. We are on Chapter 6, which is called God's Preferential Option. Exodus 22, 21 through 27. Already he's signaling through this subtitle of the chapter that he is borrowing from language from liberation theology, which posits that God is always advocating for the oppressed in the situations that they find themselves in. So that's not language that you'll find in the text, but it's language that he's tying the text to from our own modern context. And the verses he singled out as pivotal in the Exodus story and in the story of Israel's sojourn out of Egypt and into the Promised Land are from Exodus chapter 22, 21 through 27, a longer section which reads, "You shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them. If you take your neighbor's cloak and pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only clothing to use as cover. In what else shall that person sleep? And if your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate." He selects this passage from a collection of commandments found in Exodus 20, 22 through chapter 23, verse 33, named by scholars as the Book of the Covenant. That's what I asked you. That's why I asked you if you had read anything surrounding this passage. It's one section of longer list of commandments and suggestions for how to live and how to treat your livestock, your slaves, your spouses, your virgins. I mean, just all of these different groups, what to do. And he writes that it's likely the oldest collection of commandments in the Old Testament. You may remember way back 2 years ago now, almost, where we talked about the different literary traditions that are compiled in the Torah. Well, this is a section that is thought to be older than some of what surrounds it. And he didn't elaborate more on that. I'm taking him at his word here. Maybe some of you can do more research into that. These commandments, he writes, variously pertain to much more specific and local matters in the community, whereas the 10 commandments deal with quite broad principles and generalities, which is why we like them. They don't get in the nitty-gritty detail. They're more broadly applicable. Today's reading is more detailed. Of these commands, Brueggemann has singled out 2 for comment because he suggests that they are the taproot in the tradition of commandments that has in recent time eventuated in the notion of God's preferential option for the poor, which I alluded to at the beginning with his subtitle for this chapter. That is, he wants us to see that these verses we're considering today are foundational to the claim that God is on the side of the oppressed and is working to undo the works of oppressors. 3 classes of vulnerable people are singled out specifically as those who are to be treated well: the immigrant or resident alien, the widow, and the orphan. This list contains those who were most vulnerable in this time period. He writes, "In such a society, these vulnerable groups of people are acutely subject to exploitation when the society is that word is a typo. Sometimes it autocorrects. But the idea is it's uncurled in its predatory greed." I'm sorry. I'll have to go. Let me open my book here to find out what uncurled. Has anybody ever had their own society uncurled? I apologize.
Your pages are different than mine, so I can't look it up.
Oh, yeah. So, and also you notice when I put B-77, that's just me shorthand for Brueggemann. I've stopped typing it all out. 77 in my copy. I guess I should have just skirted past this because it's.
Oh,
Did you find it?
well, I saw, I will kill you.
Oh,
I
here it
saw
is. Here it
that.
is. Oh, here, uncurbed.
Uncurbed. Okay.
Is it, so I'll try that again. In such a society,
Uncurbed.
these vulnerable groups of people are acutely subject to exploitation when the society is uncurbed in its predatory greed. And the idea being this section we just are considering is meant to give instruction as to help curb the predatory greed. So encoded in the law are prohibitions and rules meant to curb Israel's ability to exploit the most vulnerable among them. They are given number two reasons as motivations for keeping these commands. One, because they had been immigrants themselves in Egypt. And this is a common theme in the Torah. I counted 5 times in the book of Deuteronomy alone where it says, remember you were enslaved in Egypt. And then we'll go on to explain how to treat the foreigner or the widow or some other exploited class. Remember you were slaves in Egypt. Don't forget that. You forget that and you will begin to treat people poorly. It's like that with empathy. When you stop empathizing with somebody, it's easier to exploit them. And then the second reason is a much more blunted edge, because if they don't, they will face the wrath of God. Simply put, God will not allow suffering to continue. In fact, verses 23 through 24 describe God's wrath in ways that make this modern reader, me, yours truly, Heath Jones, exceedingly uncomfortable. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely heed their cry. Echoes of the beginning of Exodus when the people are being abused by the Pharaoh in Egypt and they cry out to God and God heeds them. In line with that, God, I will surely heed their cry. My wrath will burn and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows and your children orphans, which in my reading, just leaves more widows and orphans, but make of that what you will. And while I don't believe that God literally annihilates people with a sword in a fit of rage, what this passage implies about God's feelings about the vulnerable being oppressed is plain. It makes God very angry when people are oppressed. As was the case with the Israelites in Egypt, God will hear the cries of the oppressed and take action on their behalf. In the words of Brueggemann, page 79 in my Kindle version, Yahweh is the great protector of the vulnerable, the great adversary against oppressors, and the one who intervenes in socioeconomic disputes on the side of the victims. In this statement, there is no reflection upon intermediate human agents who will enact such punitive violence or the sword. And so Brueggemann is assuming that this judgment involves other human agents that bring the judgment about. And it doesn't give any more detail. And Brueggemann here is, I think, sidestepping the uncomfortable image of God annihilating the people with a sword and more or less getting to the main point. And I do agree. The main point is that God is made angry and filled with a holy anger when people are oppressed and will take action. Going on with the quote, direct divine action is anticipated, though we are not told how this may happen. In any case, the motivation is a strong impetus for the curbing of economic predation because the holiness of God is not neutral, benign, or indifferent to such predatory conduct and policy. That's an important point. God is not neutral or benign or indifferent when somebody is being exploited. God takes a side, and God's side is on the side of the exploited. To summarize, 1, when the oppressed cry out, God intervenes on behalf of the oppressed, and 2, the oppressors get their comeuppance. Next, Brueggemann turns our attention to commands concerning loans and interest. In quoting his translation of this text, verses 25 through 27, in his translation read, if you lend money, you shall not act as creditor. You shall not exact interest. If you take a neighbor's cloak in collateral, you shall return it at sundown. He writes of this, the commandment is a recognition that transactions of credit and debt are the most accessible arena for creative victims through the exercise of social leverage. Against that propensity, the 2 prohibitions command neighborliness and not hard-nosed finance. Notice what he's doing there. He's reframing the way that we interact, way debtors and debt holders, lendees and lendors interact by saying there's not even collateral. If somebody has held a coat as collateral, return it that very night, because they may need it if they're cold. And make good on debt is implied, but using no force or leverage, such as interest or holding things as collateral. The strong, going on with the quote, the strong are not to cast themselves as creditors, because that generates debtors. The reason for the inequity of credit and debt, moreover, is the menace of interest on loans. Thus, the commandment envisions an economic practice of neighborliness that eschews non-covenantal dramas of leverage that inevitably produce victims. And I put here as a picture, payday loan companies as an obvious example of this. But as somebody who holds substantial student loans and a mortgage and other things, I got to say, we've become accustomed to this idea in our culture that we hold debt and that we will pay interest on debt, and that just simply is the way things are. But who can deny the leverage that this does give our creditors and even our government agencies over us, should they decide to collect certain kinds of debts or prioritize certain kind of debts over others? We've come so used to lenders lending with interest that it's hard to imagine the world described here. Described here is a world where even a coat cannot be held as collateral for a loan overnight, for fear that the person will be cold in the night. Simple as that. How far removed is this practice from our own? For today, a person can lose their home as a result of debt, which is far worse than losing one's coat. In sum, Brueggemann's summation, the two commandments yield 5 absolute commands. You shall not wrong or oppress. You shall not abuse. You shall not cast yourself as creditor. You shall not charge interest. You shall return the loan coat. The subject of these absolutes are the vulnerable, widow, orphan, immigrant, poor. And the enforcer is Yahweh, who will hear the cries of the oppressed. The God who hears will come in wrath. The God who hears is compassionate. These two properties of God as enforcer of covenantal neighborliness are of a piece. Compassion is a divine propensity toward the victim. Wrath is a divine propensity toward the predators. The enforcement of compassion/wrath advocates an alternative economy in which predatory coveting is precluded. In other words, God will not need to resort to any form of wrath if these edicts are kept. It is Brueggemann's contention that, and the contention of other modern liberation theologians, by the way, I'm using theological nerd terminology here. Liberation theology is a branch of theology that focuses most on the ways in which God wants to liberate people in real time from not only their spiritual chains, but also their other forms of enslavement, whether they're enslaved to their hungry bellies, to an economic situation or others, that God's work is bent towards liberating people spiritually and physically, their material circumstance as well. So that's what I'm talking about there. So to start over, it is Brueggemann's contention and the contention of other modern liberation theologians that God still moves and works on behalf of the oppressed and vulnerable, that God is even now on the move to liberate the oppressed and thwart the oppressors. God is not even-handed, but is allied with the victims against exploitative systems, writes Brueggemann. If this is the case, then what might this mean for us in 2022? He concludes with this paragraph that I'm going to quote at length. We are witnesses now to a massive accumulation of capital by the 1% that controls global finance and that manages the levers of power and privilege. The accumulation of misery is, perforce, a necessary condition of that arrangement. In ancient times with Pharaoh, and in our time with cheap labor and all that goes with it. The rhetoric of divine wrath and divine compassion is an assertion that this cannot stand. It is disrupted by the cry, and the cry mobilizes the God who has not succumbed to the narrative of domination. So he leaves that open-ended, as open-ended as he leaves our interpretation of what it means for God to annihilate with the sword. It says the same God whose wrath is stored up against the oppressor is still on the move. And what does that mean for oppressors today? And what will shift to liberate the oppressed? And that seems to be an open-ended question, but the will and desire and the focus of God, I think, is clear, as is represented in this text. And so before we move on to conversation about this chapter, just to let you know, next class will be on August the 4th. That's 3 weeks from today, I think. 1 week, 2, yeah, 3 weeks from today. And that'll be on chapter 7. But in the meantime, I'll open it up to conversation. This chapter threw a lot at us, and I think it moved rather quickly. So I'm curious to hear how what questions arose in your minds, or comments, or observations.
Well, the things that were mentioned sound sort of framed around do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, if you know, with a very graphic description of how that would play out, is just like, okay, so if you're going to abuse widows and orphans, how would you feel if that was your wife, your children? I was trying to make that make sense to me without the harshness of it.
Mhm.
What I like about, go ahead, sorry.
No, I wonder too, Connie, was this like a literal big stick, or was this like a, you know,
If this could happen
just
to
how
them, it could happen to you.
yeah, or is this just an extreme, like, yeah, this is how seriously I take this kind of broach of what I expect of you? I mean, I don't know. I mean,
what Brueggemann does with it is he says yes to the second thing you said, that this is showing how God feels and the tenor of God's anger towards those who oppress the vulnerable. But then he wants to say, as far as how the judgment is meted out, well, God doesn't have a literal like sword. God isn't we shouldn't anthropomorphize God in that way. The what happens, I guess they could look back to what happened in Egypt in the story of their own Exodus and say, well, maybe that sort of thing, although that hasn't happened since. And again, discussions about the plagues that visited Egypt is a whole nother topic for another time. But what he wants us to come away with is this idea that God is infuriated at those who oppress others, and that God will do something about it. As surely as God came down to liberate the people from Egypt, those who oppress people will face their comeuppance. I have complex feelings about this idea. And I have generally positive feelings about liberation theology with a few caveats. One of the things that liberation theology does that I appreciate is it keeps the focus on who is being hurt today by the actions of others. And what does our faith call us to do about it? How does it call us to think about it? Who does it call us to notice? And I love the liberation theology for that. One of its traps that if we're not careful, we fall into is it divides the world into two camps of oppressors and oppressed. And the world is more complicated than that. There are obvious moments where people are clearly in the category of oppressed with no volition of their own. But then there are other times in history where people are causing pain to one another, and there are no clear, to give one side the label oppressed and the other side oppressor is more complex. And I feel like we lose that nuance in these dichotomies, these labels of either and or. And so there needs to be more. That's why I don't call myself a liberation theologian. I call myself somebody who appreciates liberation theology and draws heavily from that conversation.
I can understand that. What you're saying, I appreciate that.
Walter Brueggemann is a liberation theologian and a liberation Bible scholar. So what he is wanting to do, and this is where you do get unbalanced readings, and he is, the more you read of him, he is not really apologetic for this. He says, this is what I offer, is this critique. There are other critiques that balance it out, but what I'm here to do is to point out Who is the oppressor? Who is the oppressed in the biblical narrative? What does God do about it there? What does God teach the people about these practices in the biblical text? And what might we draw from these teachings today, basically?
So if one is an advocate, you can always advocate for liberation, but it doesn't always have to say that there is a downtrodden that's so wretched and so without resources that they're always, poor and meager and weak. And then there's always and victimized, and then there's always an oppressor that's wicked and evil and so sinful they have to be annihilated. I mean, that creates these two opposing forces, and the only solution is to annihilate the big baddies, and there's the only redemption is for the poor sinned against people. I mean, that doesn't make sense to me, but I think we have to recognize that the people who have been downtrodden also have resources and can use those to be empowered and pull themselves. I don't know. I'm not making sense, but
sometimes, so like, would I consider myself an oppressed person because I have student loans that I think the way that the student loan and education system with loan is really predatory and encumbers generations, my generation and the one after me, in debt that will be with me till I'm in my 60s, I believe, if I pay it off on time. And is that oppression? You can make a case that it's in a soft sense. Would I consider myself the oppressed? No, not the oppressed class. I have many other areas in my life where I have access to privilege that my place in life affords, where I was born, my age, my gender, other things. So it's more complex. And I feel like are the people at Sally Mae who hold my loan, are they oppressors? I talk to these people on the phone. They're usually people working a day job who are just, doing what was required of them by their job description. And I don't think there are really very many.
That's something where you agree to the terms. You know what the terms are. And so what you're doing.
That's what I keep getting told. At the age of 18, I was told for this $25,000 loan because if you don't do this, you flip burgers at McDonald's. And the implications of that private loan, I did not really understand at 18. I have to be,
or what the economic implications would be for your future. Yeah, at that point.
But what it was clear on paper. I understand what you're saying, Connie. But my only point of bringing that up is when you're talking about, we love to caricature an oppressed class so that we can gin up compassion and sympathy where we often don't have compassion and sympathy for people that we ought. And then on the other hand, we want to create a caricature of a villain, an oppressor who is arbitrarily just to be the way that evil people are talked about as just a sort of evil, this sort of other kind of person, not like us, who has all of their efforts hell bent on hell raising. And when you meet people who are in charge of bad decisions that hurt people, they're never that way. They have their reasons, and maybe they're cynical and resigned to systems that, an economic system that hurts others, or maybe they're ignorant and they don't know exactly what it is that their actions are doing in the broader scheme of things.
I think my problem with this is that this is written in a different time. This is written when a community was a set group, and maybe distance off someplace else there's another community, but this is a set group. So if someone is not nice to someone and everybody's supposed to know the rules, you're supposed to do, then in the community you handle that. But we're no longer the community, we're the world.
Mm,
And we see injustice. We see the poor in every country. We
mm,
see the poor in downtown Indianapolis. How are the average person supposed to be able to take care of all the poor? Because you do what you can, and that's it. That you can't do anything else. And how do you reprimand or discipline or punish the people while they got that way? I mean, I heard this one about Sudan, that they were eating lily pads
wow.
because that's all they had.
Wow.
There was flooding, they had lily pads. And once in a while they might get a fish, but they had to be careful because the water was contaminated and the fish could make them sick. Now that to me is poverty. I mean, you can't get any worse than eating lily pads.
Mm-hmm.
But what am I on the other side of the world supposed to do about that, except support something like Samaritan's Purse or Open Doors or Operation Blessing or something like that? I mean, and then I can only give what I can give. And I think this scripture has to do with that little compact world that when it was written, and not so much about the world today.
I agree. I agree with the point you're making. That last thing you said, and actually a lot of what you said I resonate with. That we're talking in a different context, and we're not talking about the entire world. We're talking about a specific people, and that's easier to manage. And
I can help my neighbor. My neighbor needs something. I can help my neighbor. So that I do. But
so the underlying
point, the other side.
The underlying point that God hates oppression and God wants to liberate the oppressed. You can take that. How that plays out for me as an individual, how I participate in God's liberating work, is where we really find ourselves either overwhelmed, or having to refocus on just what we can control, our literal neighbors. This is where I want to point out that in today's time, most of the evils we face as a culture are not individuals doing specific things to individuals, but rather systems we've put in place that have inequities baked into them. And so we can't do anything as individuals to help all of the people in the underpasses in Indianapolis, even much less in the Sudan where they're eating lily pads. But when we're thinking about maybe a policy that wants to make it illegal for people to sleep under overpasses,
when they've been doing it for years.
I'm studying a man right now. I have a weird interest in this one fellow. I get fascinated with in the last 2 weeks. His man named Robert Moses. Does anyone know Robert Moses?
Yeah, I know that name.
He's the man predominantly responsible for the design of New York City.
Right. Yeah.
And this has had implications in every city, because people looked at, as New York goes, so did the rest of the nation in that time in the 50s and 60s when he had the most sway and the most influence. And he has his name on a lot of parks. In fact, he said, this is my paraphrase, but he said it in clear words: if you are an advocate for parks, then you can do about anything politically. People love parks. Make parks, and you can do what you want to do. What he wanted to do politically was to keep New York segregated. And the way he did that, as he had design over all of from the design of the subways to the roads, was he made sure that like bridges that went to parks where affluent white people would go, he made sure that they were too low for public buses to go through. He would reduce the size of the bridge to where they couldn't pass through. There's no legal segregation here. There's no law that says Black people can't go to this park. But if they're relying on public transit, as most poor people are, and in New York, most people of color would have, then they can't go to this park. And this was the things that he was doing on purpose all over the city. He designed the subways in a way that they couldn't be expanded, because he did not believe that he did not believe in public transport and did not want there to be wide access to it. And so he instead built a series of roads and highways all over New York that made people need to buy cars to get around, which is why traffic is so terrible to this very day, and why expanding public transport is almost inconceivable undertaking, because he had so arranged the grid and the plan in a way that made it very difficult to consider expanding public transit in the future. He would put highways through neighborhoods in ways that would draw like barriers, like walls. It's not literally building a wall like they did in Detroit to segregate communities, but to in a way that's legally and not racist on paper. Anyway, he did all these things. My point is, from what I read of him as an individual, you probably would enjoy meeting him. In fact, wasn't more racist than people of his own time. In fact, would I want to return tit for tat, as our verse today we're considering suggests, and like isolate him, keep him out of parks and do things that would make his life miserable? No, I don't think that would be helpful. But now that we do live in a global community and a wider community, like New York is a much larger community than the people we're talking about even today's text, rather than one answer can be treat your neighbor well, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That much we can control. But in the broader picture, as we think about who legislates on our behalf and how public works are funded and other things, in a democracy, that's where I think we can put our weight behind, with a great amount of pessimism, honestly, because I don't feel very optimistic. There's a lot that will get done. What I'm trying to say, Sue, is that the issues in the global scale and even the larger scale, like in our city, are not going to be, and you can't as an individual fix that. But there are issues that are really more about the systems we live under, rather than the individuals that do specific wrongs, that we can critique and hopefully change. Again, with a great amount of pessimism. I'm going to wear my pessimism on my sleeve today because, well,
Yeah.
I don't know. Did that?
No, I think people are seduced by profit, power, and influence, and our people who are elected to federal government, even state and local government, it's no different. It's just at the federal government level, they have so much more opportunity to gain all of those things. And some remain true to their ideals, some remain true to their office, and others succumb. And it is it's really a shame, but I think we have to, like you said, be a little pessimistic, Heath, that the people that we elect are not serving the broader population, but they're serving other powers that allow them to gain power, profit, and influence. And, the minute that they get into office, what they're trying to do is remain in office so they can accumulate all of those things. And it's not, party does not necessarily matter. There are a few.
The corporate money flows to both parties.
That's right. That's
basically
right.
equal amounts.
Yeah.
Oftentimes corporations will support in one state Democrats and another state Republicans, depending on who they feel is going to hold the levers of power.
Unfortunately,
well, no, Judy wasn't quite done. I interrupted her. I'm sorry.
So they end up passing laws. Here's a good example. We're all going to be, if we're not already, on Medicare. Medicare has the worst relationship with the pharmaceutical companies, and therefore we pay exorbitant amounts of money for our drugs, our medications, more so than any other leading, like industrialized nation on the planet. My stepmother has to go on an antiarrhythmic drug, and Medicare, with Medicare, it costs $800 a month. Well, they have a way to get drugs from Canada. If they get it from Canada, it is, I don't know. I mean, it's just like, how can this be? But it's going to take 3 months in order to get that prescription filled. Well, she's an atrial fib right now. She can't get there. There's like this sequence of events. She can't get her cardioversion in the hospital until she's on the medication. So she could get the medication from Canada, but she has to wait 3 months to get her cardioversion, and she can't afford to pay $800 a month for this, because Medicare has no really good relationship because of our legislators in Washington, D.C. So, I mean, this is an example where they are actually propping up the profits of the pharmaceutical companies, who are not hurting, by the way. They're making plenty of profits, but because they have one of the biggest lobbies in Washington, D.C., that continually, say, hey, legislators, we'll give lots of money to your campaigns. Just keep sending the laws our way. We pay the price. We pay the price because we pay the bills ultimately. And it's just not right. It's not right. And that affects all of us. So that's just a recent
And what I was going to say to that is, unfortunately, these things get done without the general population knowing that they're being done. It's not something that we can actively have any kind of decision-making power, because it's done. It's sometimes put into bills that it's secret in there.
Right.
They slip things in because they want something else done.
Right.
And so they're making concessions, maybe without even knowing what the implications are.
Right.
My mind went there after what Sue said, and now we're talking. This actually has a logical flow. This conversation does, because I'm wanting to, like, the individuals who lobby for a healthcare industry or work for healthcare industries. You meet them, many of them will be lovely people, and not any probably more or less immoral than us here. Given the right context, the right job opportunities, say you became an entry level job. If I think back to my student loans, if I started answering the phones at Sally Mae, my first job, and then who knows where that goes in 15 years. You don't address these issues by punishing individuals or by taking your own individual resources and saying, well, you're Judy, would you say your mother-in-law?
I'm sorry, you cut out.
Your mother-in-law couldn't get them.
Stepmother, my stepmother.
Isn't to say, similar to the problem in Sudan, Sue, you can't go and feed all the people in Sudan. I can't go and pay for your stepmother's medication. But if there were,
I can't either.
If there were enough awareness, you can change, and enough push from lots of people together, you could change how we operate as a society, and specifically our healthcare system. When the Affordable Care Act was being debated, at first, the healthcare lobby was not allowed to participate in these discussions, and representatives from the largest health insurers and the largest pharmaceutical companies were not allowed. But then they realized they couldn't get the votes to pass it until congressmen and women who had as their constituents lobbyists from these industries. Maybe in their state they had a large manufacturer. There was enough. They would withhold their votes until they were brought to the table. And so part of the negotiating for setting prices for these medicines and these procedures are the people who are offering the medicines and the procedures. And while it does provide subsidies for some people, more people to afford medicine at exorbitant costs, it does nothing to bring down the costs that should not be that high in the first place.
Right,
Cost
right.
medicine that costs sometimes 20 times more than it did back in the 70s. Not new stuff, not innovative technology, insulin, stuff like
Insulin.
that. And so bring it back. How does the God of the Exodus narrative feel about all of this? And what movements of God's Spirit, what is God's Spirit leading the people towards in regards to issues like this, is the question I think he wants to have on our minds. I confessedly feel myself a bit frustrated in that I just feel like I can buy into the principle and the hope that God is going to help us with all of these things: hunger, healthcare, global war, all of these things. There have been lots of examples in history of people not getting their comeuppance and living quite well to the very end of their lives, profiting under these systems. So I don't know.
Gotta give it to God and let him take care of it.
What's that?
My version of that, Sue, she said, give it to God and let God take care of it. My version of that is hold on to a radical hope that all the promises of Easter really will break in to our lives. And we hope we live in that expectancy. That's what I do.
Yeah.
And there are revivals. There are moments in history where something shifts in a big way and people are blessed. And we'll see if I want to live through one.
Yep.
I want my kids to live through one. I'm tired of.
Yeah, everybody started going to church after 9/11.
That's why Kelly started going to church.
They don't go. Many of them now do not go at all.
I've heard so many stories of people living through moments in history that were important in a positive sense. I just want to see one myself, but maybe people remember things through rose-colored lens. I don't know, but no, these sort of teachings get me all worked up because they make me hope for the moon, and then I come back down feeling.
Got to give it to God.
Thank you, Sue.
He is the only one that has the answers. He has the plans and he has the answers. I can't do it.
Some of you need to know this about Sue. I feel led to tell you that after a sermon where I may be especially worked up about something and I might feel emotionally off afterwards, even if it went very well, Sue will give me a hug in the back of the sanctuary as I'm about to take my place to shake hands as people exit. And I feel your care right now. Thank you, Sue.
Yeah.
I think it's so true that, that to God say surrender, and sometimes Spirit says, hey, I'm inspiring you to think this way or do this, that even if a small thing, write to your senator or, appeal to this person or approach it this way. So in those moments of surrender, sometimes there's an inspiration. If I just breathe. So
Sometimes
I think
it's intent. It's to change your mind and your heart. And then the how, maybe we discover together, or maybe we hold this hope to the very end and we never lived. Maybe it's Moses on the mountain looking in the promised land. It's a powerful metaphor that is used again and again by people who feel like they're a part of a movement. Martin Luther King Jr. quoted that, used that in a sermon the last sermon he preached. He mentioned Moses on the mountain with the conviction that he wouldn't live to see all that he hoped. And that's going to be true of all of us in a way. I guess maybe being young and idealistic and having kids, I just want to see something. Maybe I'm nostalgic for the 90s. I don't know.
For the good old days.
I don't know. Yeah.
the 90s,
Maybe,
90s.
90s.
The 90s, really?
How about the 60s?
I was a child. I was a child in the 90s, and I remember things in through that lens. I remember the simpler world. I remember the stark change after 9/11. I remember there being controversy and people being worked up about things, but it was at a, maybe because I was a child, I just didn't feel as burned by it, and so that's my period that I remember as like this simpler time is the 90s. I betray my age.
I continue to pray for the Ukrainian people and the
Mhm.
war that's going on, and I've prayed every day since this whole thing started. And one time I heard someone showed a map of what was going to be required for Gog to come down and into Israel. And it includes Ukraine. And so at that point, I exchanged my prayer and I said, okay, God, you've got your plans. And that's what I want done. I want your plans to be completed, not mine. But I continue to pray every day that the destruction will stop and the death will stop and peace will come. And if that means Russia has to go in and take the country to bring peace, then it's God's plan. I mean, if it's part of God coming down to wipe out Israel, then it's going to happen. It's God's plan.
You just dropped a theological bomb into the room.
Right.
That
it's almost 1:00.
We don't have time to but what I will join you in is my ardent prayer that the violence and the suffering stop. And I join you in that.
Mhm.
And that Iran doesn't send their drones.
Unless it's
Russia
God's
doesn't-
will for those drones to come in. And I'm being facetious here. I'm being
Yeah,
ornery.
I
being
know, you're
ornery.
right. It could very well be his plans, but
I don't think drones, I do not believe that militaristic drones are God's intent. I think it's like, does God want us to make poison or roll in poison ivy? They're there. You can do it. But just because it happens doesn't mean it's divinely ordained. And a lot that we do
yeah.
is not. But again, that's a doozy, Sue. Thanks for that. We'll,
Oh, if you only knew what went on in my mind.
it's 3:00.
Sometimes I keep my
Okay.
mouth silent.
Sometimes we all do, and it's important to know when to talk and when not to.
Yeah.
I feel like that wasn't me saying you shouldn't have said what you said. I'm agreeing with you. Okay. On that note, I'll see you in 3 weeks. I'll see you all before 3 weeks. And Judy, I'll try not to be a stranger since you're far away. I'll see everyone else in person before then, and I'll try to connect with you, Judy, before then.
Okay.
And,
Well, it's good to see everyone.
yeah, take
Good
care.
to see you too.
Okay.
Keith,
All
I have
right.
one